Jake Martinez stared at the broken engine of his transport ship and knew his day had gone from bad to worse. The small cargo vessel that was supposed to take him back to Earth after his patrol mission now sat dead in the docking bay of Nexus Prime, sparks still flying from its damaged core. The mechanic, a four-armed alien with blue skin, shook his head and pointed at the price display. The repair cost was more than Jake made in 6 months as a soldier. 3,000 credits minimum, the mechanic said in broken English. Engine. Core is fried. Need new parts from Kepler Station. Jake checked his wallet and sighed. 200 credits. That was all he had left after buying food and paying for temporary housing. His next transport home would not arrive for another month, and he needed work fast, or he would be sleeping on the streets of this expensive space station, Nexus. Prime was not like the rough frontier worlds where Jake usually served. This place was fancy, full of diplomats and rich traders from across the galaxy. The buildings reached high into artificial skies, and everything cost 10 times what it should. Jake felt out of place in his simple military uniform, among all the well-dressed aliens walking around with expensive jewelry and personal bodyguards. He found a job posting board near the main plaza and scanned the available work. Most positions required skills he did not have, or languages he could not speak. Then he saw something that caught his eye. Security guard needed at the diplomatic quarter. Basic pay, but it was honest work, and they specifically wanted someone with military experience. The hiring manager was a stern woman named Carol, from the security company. She looked at Jake's service record and nodded approval. We need someone who can stay calm under pressure, she explained. The diplomatic quarter gets all kinds of visitors. Some friendly, some not so much. Your job is to watch, listen, and report anything unusual. Simple enough? Jake took the job immediately. The uniform was basic black with a small badge, nothing fancy. His beat was the embassy district where representatives from dozens of worlds conducted business. Most days were quiet. He walked his rounds, checked identification cards, and made sure no one caused trouble. The other guards were a mix of species, but they accepted Jake easily enough. His supervisor was an older human named Pete, who had worked security for 20 years. Keep your eyes open and your mouth shut, Pete advised. These diplomat types like their privacy, but they also like feeling safe. Do your job well, and they tip good. For 3 weeks, Jake settled into a routine. Morning shift, evening rounds. Sleep in the cheap housing block with other temporary workers. It was not exciting, but it paid the bills and let him save money for ship repairs. He was starting to think his luck might be changing when everything went sideways. It started with screaming. Jake was checking the main entrance to the Galactic Council embassy when explosions echoed from inside the building. Security alarms began wailing as smoke poured from broken windows. People ran in all directions, some injured, all terrified. Jake's military training kicked in automatically. While other guards stood frozen, he rushed toward the danger. Inside the embassy, masked figures with energy weapons were shooting at anyone who moved. Jake did not have a weapon, but he knew the building layout from his daily rounds. He found a group of civilians trapped in a conference room. Among them was a figure in a dark hooded cloak who seemed strangely calm despite the chaos. The person was small and moved with confidence that suggested they were used to dangerous situations. This way, Jake whispered, leading them through a service corridor he had discovered during his rounds. The masked attackers were focused on the main areas, and had not yet found this hidden passage. As they moved through the narrow hallway, Jake heard footsteps behind them. One of the attackers had found their trail. Jake pushed the civilians ahead and turned to face the threat. The attacker raised his weapon, but Jake was faster. His military combat training served him well as he disarmed the man and knocked him unconscious. The hooded figure watched Jake with interest. You move like a soldier, the person said in a voice that sounded ancient, despite being soft and feminine. I am a soldier, Jake replied, helping her over some debris. Just working security until I can get home. They reached the emergency exit safely. Outside, station security was finally arriving to handle the situation. The hooded figure stood, apart from the other civilians, and Jake noticed that several very important-looking aliens were approaching her with obvious respect and concern. I should thank you properly, the figure said. Turning back to Jake, she pulled back her hood, and Jake's breath caught in his throat. The woman before him looked young, maybe 30 years old, but her eyes held depths that spoke of centuries of experience. Her skin had a slight silver tint, and her hair moved as if floating in water, despite there being no breeze. She was beautiful in a way that seemed almost supernatural. I am Empress Lyra Vextera, she said simply, and you just saved the ruler of the Andromedian Empire. Jake felt his knees go weak. The Andromedian Empire controlled half the known galaxy. This woman commanded the loyalty of billions of beings across thousands of worlds, and he had just treated her like any other person who needed help. I did not know, he stammered. I just saw someone who needed help. Lyra smiled, and for a moment, she looked genuinely pleased rather than formally polite. That is exactly why your actions mean something, she said. Most people help me because they know who I am and what they might gain. You helped because it was the right thing to do. Her advisors were getting nervous, clearly wanting to rush her to safety, but Lyra seemed in no hurry to leave. What is your name, soldier? Jake Martinez, Your Majesty, he replied, not sure of the proper way to address an empress. Jake Martinez, she repeated, as if testing how the name sounded. I think we should talk again soon, when things are less chaotic. Before Jake could respond, her security team surrounded her and escorted her to a waiting ship. Jake stood there watching the most powerful person in the galaxy disappear into the night sky, wondering if he had just imagined the whole encounter. Pete found him still standing there 10 minutes later. You okay, kid? You look like you saw a ghost. Jake shook his head and tried to process what had just happened. Something like that, he said, still staring at the stars where her ship had vanished. Jake thought he would never see the Empress again. But 3 days after the embassy attack, a message arrived at his tiny apartment. The communication device displayed the official seal of the Andromedian Empire, and Jake nearly dropped it when he realized what he was looking at. Jake Martinez, the message began in Lyra's unmistakable voice. I would like to continue our conversation. Please meet me at the Celestial Gardens tomorrow at sunset. Come alone. Jake spent the next day worrying about what an empress could possibly want with him. The Celestial Gardens were the most expensive part of Nexus Prime, where only the wealthy and powerful could afford to visit. Jake had never been there, and he felt nervous walking through the beautiful crystal archways and floating water features. He found Lyra sitting on a bench beside a fountain that sparkled with lights from distant stars. She wore simple clothes instead of royal robes, and for a moment she looked like any other woman enjoying the evening air. But when she looked up at Jake, those ancient eyes reminded him exactly who she was. You came, she said, seeming genuinely pleased. I was not certain you would. Jake sat down carefully, leaving space between them. You are an empress. When you ask someone to come, they come. Lyra laughed, and the sound was surprisingly warm. You would be surprised how many people find excuses to avoid meeting with me. Being an empress can be very lonely. They talked for hours. Lyra asked Jake about his life, his family back on Earth, and his experiences as a soldier. Jake found himself telling her things he had never shared with anyone. About growing up poor in Detroit, about joining the military to pay for his sister's medical treatments, about feeling lost in a galaxy that seemed too big and complicated for someone like him. In return, Lyra shared stories of her own. She told Jake about the weight of ruling billions of people, about making decisions that affected entire star systems, about the constant political games and betrayals that surrounded her every day. Jake began to understand that being the most powerful person in the galaxy came with a price he could never have imagined. "I have been alive for 710 years, Lyra said as the artificial sunset painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. "I have seen empires rise and fall, watched species evolve and change, survived wars that lasted centuries. But I have never met anyone quite like you." Jake did not know how to respond to that. "I am just a regular guy," he said. "Nothing special about me." "That is where you are wrong," Lyra replied. "Do you know what I see when I look at most people? Fear, greed, ambition, or worship. They want something from me, or they are terrified of me. But when you look at me, you see a person. Just a person who happened to need help." Over the following weeks, they met regularly, sometimes in the gardens, sometimes in quiet cafes, where Lyra could sit unrecognized under a hood. Jake learned that despite her power, Lyra was deeply tired. Centuries of ruling had worn her down, and she struggled with feeling disconnected from the very people she protected. Then one evening, Lyra's mood was different. She seemed nervous, which was unusual for someone who commanded fleets of starships. "Jake," she began carefully, "I need to tell you something important. My empire is in crisis." She explained the situation in terms that Jake could understand. The Galactic Senate, a body of representatives from thousands of worlds, had grown concerned about immortal rulers. They had passed a law requiring that any leader who lived longer than 500 years must produce an heir within one solar cycle, or their government would be dissolved. The law was designed to prevent stagnation, Lyra explained. The Senate fears that immortal rulers become too set in their ways, too removed from the concerns of ordinary people. In some ways, they are not wrong. Jake listened as Lyra described her previous attempts to fulfill this requirement. She had married twice, before both times two powerful alien nobles for political reasons. But the genetic differences between species made reproduction nearly impossible, even with advanced medical technology. "My scientists have been working on this problem for decades," Lyra continued. "They have tested compatibility with hundreds of different species. Most combinations simply do not work. Others produce offspring that are not viable." Jake was beginning to see where this conversation was heading, and it made him very uncomfortable. "Recently, my researchers made a discovery," Lyra said. "Human genetic material is remarkably adaptable, more so than any other known species. With the right medical procedures, a human could successfully produce an heir with my people." Jake sat in silence for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. "You are asking me to help you have a child," he said finally. "I am asking for much more than that," Lyra replied. "Imperial law requires that any heir be born from a legal marriage between the ruler and their consort. I am asking you to marry me." Jake felt like the world had tilted sideways. "You want to marry me, but I am nobody. I work security for minimum wage. I do not even own a decent pair of shoes." "You are exactly what I need," Lyra said firmly. "Not because of your genetics, though that matters, but because you are the first person in centuries who treats me like a human being instead of a political symbol." Jake stood up and began pacing, his mind racing. "This is insane. I cannot marry an empress. I do not know anything about politics, or ruling, or any of that stuff. I would embarrass you in front of the entire galaxy." "You would learn," Lyra said. "I would teach you. My advisors would teach you. But more importantly, you would teach me. You would help me remember what it feels like to care about individual people, instead of just statistics and policies." Jake thought about his life on Earth, his tiny apartment, his job that barely paid the bills, his future that seemed to stretch ahead with no real purpose or meaning. Then he thought about Lyra, alone with the weight of billions of lives on her shoulders, "What happens if I say no?" he asked. Lyra's expression grew sad. "Then my empire falls apart. The Senate will dissolve my government and divide my territories among other powers. Billions of people who depend on the stability I provide will suffer through wars and chaos while new governments establish themselves." Jake realized she was not trying to pressure him with guilt. She was simply telling him the truth about what was at stake. The decision was his to make, but the consequences would affect far more than just the two of them. "I need time to think," Jake said. "Of course," Lyra replied. "But I should mention that the deadline is in 6 months. If we are going to do this, we need to begin soon." Jake walked back to his apartment in a daze. An empress wanted to marry him, not just any empress, but the ruler of half the galaxy. The logical part of his mind said it was impossible, that he was not qualified for such responsibility. But another part of him, the part that had grown to care for the lonely woman behind the imperial title, wondered if maybe this was exactly what both of them needed. Jake said yes 2 weeks later, and immediately regretted it when he saw what saying yes actually meant. Within hours of his decision, Lyra's advisors descended on him like a swarm of very polite but determined aliens. His simple life on Nexus Prime vanished overnight, replaced by a whirlwind of preparation that left his head spinning. The first shock was leaving Nexus Prime entirely. Lyra's personal ship was bigger than most space stations Jake had seen, with rooms that could house entire families and technology that seemed like magic. Jake was given quarters that were larger than his childhood home, complete with a personal staff who insisted on calling him Your Highness despite his protests. "You must understand," explained Advisor Keth, a tall blue-skinned alien who seemed to be in charge of Jake's education. "You are no longer Jake Martinez, the security guard. You are Jake Martinez, Prince Consort of the Andromedian Empire. Every word you speak, every action you take, will be analyzed by billions of beings across the galaxy." The lessons began immediately. Protocol, history, languages, customs of different species, proper ways to address various nobles, table manners, 4 formal dinners with aliens who had completely different ideas about food. Jake's brain felt like it was going to explode from all the information being crammed into it. "Remember," Keth said during one particularly frustrating etiquette lesson, "when meeting the ambassador from Rigel 7, you must never show your teeth when smiling. Their species considers exposed teeth to be a threat display." Jake rubbed his forehead. "How am I supposed to remember all this? There are thousands of different species in the Empire." "Practice," Keth replied without sympathy. "The wedding will be attended by representatives from every major world. You cannot afford to insult anyone accidentally." The wedding preparations were even more overwhelming than the lessons. Jake discovered that marrying an empress was not a simple ceremony, but a week-long festival that would be broadcast across the entire galaxy. Designers from dozens of worlds competed to create his wedding outfit. Politicians argued over the guest list, and security teams planned for threats Jake had never imagined. "We have identified 47 different groups that might attempt to disrupt the ceremony," reported Security Chief Vale, a stern woman who made Jake's old military commanders look relaxed. "There are those who oppose humans gaining influence in galactic politics, those who want to destabilize the Empire, and those who simply enjoy causing chaos at important events." Jake felt sick. "Maybe we should just have a small ceremony, private. Just us, and a few close friends." Vale looked at him like he had suggested flying into a black hole. "Your Highness, this wedding represents the union of 2 peoples and the continuation of an empire that protects over 300 billion citizens. Small and private are not options." The worst part was the attention from the galactic media. Reporters from every major news organization wanted to interview the primitive human, who was marrying the most powerful being in the galaxy. Jake quickly learned to hate the constant cameras and the insulting questions about whether humans were advanced enough to participate in galactic civilization. Is it true that humans still use violence to solve disputes? Asked one particularly annoying reporter from the Centauri Broadcasting Network. We prefer talking things out, Jake replied carefully, using the diplomatic language Kath had taught him. But we defend ourselves when necessary. And what qualifies you to marry someone with 7 centuries of experience ruling the galaxy? Jake looked directly into the camera. She asked me, he said simply, and I said yes because I care about her. That answer apparently scandalized half the galaxy and impressed the other half. Jake stopped reading the news reports about himself when he realized they were making him too angry to focus on his lessons. The only bright spot in all the chaos was his time with Lyra, despite their busy schedules. She made sure they had private moments together away from advisors and reporters. During these quiet conversations, Jake began to understand the real person behind the imperial title. Are you having second thoughts? Lyra asked, one evening, as they walked through the ship's garden, a beautiful space filled with plants from hundreds of different worlds. Every day, Jake admitted, this is all way bigger than anything I ever imagined. Sometimes I feel like I am pretending to be someone I am not. Lyra smiled. I have been pretending to be someone I am not for 700 years. The difference is that you are pretending to be more important than you think you are, while I pretend to be less vulnerable than I actually am. Jake thought about that. What if I mess this up? What if I embarrass you in front of everyone? Then we will deal with it together, Lyra said. Jake, I am not marrying you because you are perfect. I am marrying you because you are real. You say what you think, you do what you believe is right, and you care about people as individuals rather than political assets. Those qualities are more valuable than any amount of diplomatic training. The wedding day arrived with a level of ceremony that made Jake dizzy. The capital world of Zarian had been preparing for months, with celebrations planned in every major city. Jake wore ceremonial armor that had been crafted by the finest artisans in the Empire, decorated with symbols representing both Earth and the Andromedian worlds. The ceremony itself took place in the Grand Cathedral, a massive structure that could hold 50,000 beings. Jake walked down an aisle that seemed to stretch for miles, past representatives from every corner of the galaxy. Some looked curious, some approving, and some openly hostile to the idea of a human joining their empress. When Jake reached the altar and saw Lyra waiting for him, all his nervousness disappeared. She wore robes that seemed to be made of starlight itself, but her smile was the same warm expression he had fallen in love with during their quiet conversations. The ceremony included rituals from dozens of different cultures, blessings in ancient languages, and vows that were translated into over 200 different tongues. When Jake spoke his promises to Lyra, his voice carried clearly through the cathedral and across the galaxy to billions of watching beings. I promise to stand beside you, to help carry the weight of your responsibilities, and to never let you forget that being an empress does not mean you have to be alone, Jake said, speaking from his heart rather than from the script his advisors had prepared. When Lyra spoke her vows, Jake heard something in her voice that he had never heard before. Hope, I promise to trust you with my heart, to value your perspective even when it challenges my own, and to build a future where both our peoples can learn from each other, she said. The moment they were declared married, celebrations erupted across the Empire. Fireworks lit up the skies of 1,000 worlds, and people danced in streets from one end of the galaxy to the other. But for Jake, the most important moment came later that night, when the ceremonies were over and the guests had gone home. Lyra sat on the edge of their bed, removing the elaborate jewelry that had been part of her wedding outfit, and Jake saw her shoulders shake with exhaustion and emotion. You did it, she said quietly. You actually went through with it. Jake sat beside her and took her hand. We did it, he corrected. Together. For the first time since he had known her, Lyra let herself cry, not from sadness, but from relief. For 7 centuries she had carried the burden of leadership alone, and now she finally had someone who would share that weight with her. Jake's first week as Prince Consort was a disaster. That would have been funny if it was not so embarrassing. The Imperial Palace on Zarian was so large that Jake got lost trying to find the dining hall on his second day. Security guards found him 3 hours later wandering around the servants' quarters, asking confused staff members for directions. "Perhaps your highness would benefit from a palace map," suggested Advisor Keth, trying to hide his frustration behind diplomatic politeness. "I had a map," Jake replied, "but this place has 17 levels, and half the rooms do not have numbers." "Who designed this thing, anyway?" "Your wife's great-great-grandmother, approximately 400 years ago," Keth answered. "It was built to impress visitors with the Empire's power and complexity." "Well, it definitely impressed me," Jake muttered. "I am impressed by how easy it is to get completely lost." The protocol disasters came fast and frequent. At his first formal dinner with alien ambassadors, Jake accidentally insulted the representative from the Vegan Confederacy by offering him meat, not knowing that vegans considered carnivores to be primitive barbarians. The next day, he shook hands with the ambassador from Titan Prime, not realizing that their species communicated through tentacle touches and considered hand contact to be roughly equivalent to kissing. "Each mistake is a learning opportunity," Keth said, after Jake's third major diplomatic incident in 5 days. "Though perhaps we could learn a bit more slowly." The worst part was the constant attention from the galactic media. Every stumble, every confused expression, every moment of uncertainty was captured by cameras and broadcast across the Empire with commentary about whether humans were truly ready to participate in galactic civilization. "Prince Consort appears. Lost in own palace," read one headline. "Human noble insults 3 species in single dinner," announced another. Jake stopped reading the news entirely when he saw a particularly cruel editorial titled, "The Empress's Mistake, Why Love Should Never Override Logic." Lyra tried to shield him from the worst of the criticism, but Jake could see the strain it was putting on her. The noble houses that had never fully supported her rule were using Jake's difficulties as evidence that she was unfit to lead the Empire. "Maybe they are right," Jake said one evening after a particularly bad day, where he had accidentally started a minor diplomatic incident by using the wrong fork during a ceremonial meal. "Maybe I am not cut out for this. The same people criticizing you now were calling me unfit to rule when I was 50 years old," Lyra replied firmly. "Learning to lead takes time. You have been a prince for 1 week. Give yourself a chance." Everything changed when Jake accompanied Lyra on his first diplomatic mission. The planets Koros and Velta had been fighting over mining rights to an asteroid field for 3 years, and their dispute was threatening to escalate into a full war that could destabilize an entire sector. Jake listened to the formal negotiations for 2 days, watching as diplomats from both sides presented elaborate arguments about historical claims and legal precedents. The talks went in circles, with neither side willing to compromise on their demands for exclusive access to the valuable minerals. "This is getting nowhere," Jake whispered to Lyra during a break. "They are arguing about who owns rocks, floating in space while people are dying in border skirmishes." "What would you suggest?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Jake studied the star charts, showing the disputed region. His military training had taught him to think tactically about territorial problems, and he saw something that diplomats had missed. "What if nobody gets exclusive rights?" Jake suggested. "Look at the asteroid field. It is huge, scattered across 3 different sectors. Instead of fighting over who owns it, why not create a neutral zone with shared mining operations?" The diplomats looked skeptical, but Jake continued. "Set up a joint mining station at the center of the field. Both planets contribute ships and workers. Both planets share the profits. Use the station as a hub for processing and distribution. It would actually be more efficient than separate operations." and neither side has to admit defeat. That would require unprecedented cooperation between species that have been enemies for decades. The lead diplomat objected. So does war, Jake pointed out. But cooperation builds things instead of destroying them. Jake spent the next day working with engineers from both planets, sketching out plans for a shared facility that could process raw materials more efficiently than either world could manage alone. His experience with military logistics helped him identify solutions that the career diplomats had overlooked when he presented his proposal to both planetary governments. Something unexpected happened. The practical benefits were so obvious that even the most stubborn officials had trouble arguing against them. Within a week, both sides had agreed to a trial partnership that would last for 5 years. How did you do that? Lyra asked as they traveled back to Zarian. Those negotiations have been deadlocked for months. I listened to what they actually wanted instead of what they said they wanted, Jake explained. They both wanted access to the minerals and security for their people. All the legal arguments were just posturing. Once we focused on practical solutions, instead of who was right, the answer became pretty obvious. Word of Jake's success spread quickly through diplomatic circles. Suddenly, the same people who had been mocking his lack of experience began requesting his input on other difficult negotiations. Jake discovered that his outsider perspective, combined with his military problem-solving skills, allowed him to see solutions that career diplomats missed. More importantly, Jake began to find his place in the complex world of imperial politics. He realized that he did not need to become a traditional diplomat. Instead, he could be something different, a bridge between the common people and the ancient institutions that governed them. You know what your real gift is? Lyra said one evening as they reviewed reports from across the Empire. You ask the questions that everyone else is afraid to ask. Like why we need 17 different forms to approve a single infrastructure project, or why our food distribution system takes 6 months to respond to famines. Jake had indeed been asking those questions, much to the frustration of various government officials. I just do not understand why everything has to be so complicated, he said. Most problems have simple solutions if you can get past all the bureaucracy. That is exactly what I mean, Lyra replied. I have been surrounded by complexity for so long that I sometimes forget to look for simple answers. You remind me that efficiency matters more than tradition. Working together, Jake and Lyra began implementing small changes that had big impacts. They streamlined the process for approving emergency aid to disaster-stricken worlds. They created direct communication channels between local governors and the imperial government. They established review boards that included ordinary citizens alongside government officials. The changes were modest, but they represented something significant, an empire that was becoming more responsive to the needs of its people. Jake might not have understood ancient diplomatic protocols, but he understood what it felt like to be powerless in the face of large institutions. That understanding made him a more effective advocate for imperial citizens than many officials who had spent their entire careers in government. The nobles are starting to respect you, Lyra observed after Jake successfully mediated a trade dispute that had been threatening to disrupt commerce across an entire sector. They respect results, Jake corrected. I just happen to be the guy delivering them right now. But Jake was beginning to understand that delivering results was exactly what being a leader meant. It was not about knowing every protocol or speaking every language. It was about caring enough about people to find solutions that actually worked. Even when those solutions were not traditional or elegant. For the first time since becoming a prince, Jake felt like he might actually be good at this job. On the 7th day of their marriage, Lyra woke Jake before dawn with an unusual request. There is something I need to show you, she said, her expression serious in a way that made Jake immediately alert. Something that no outsider has ever been permitted to see. Jake dressed quickly and followed her through corridors of the palace he had never entered before. They descended deep underground, past multiple security checkpoints that required both their biometric signatures to pass. The guards they encountered bowed deeply to Lyra, but looked surprised to see Jake with her. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, as they entered what appeared to be the most secure area of the entire palace. "To the Eternal Archive," Lyra replied. "The repository of our most important historical records. Every significant event in the Empire's history is documented there, along with certain information that has never been shared with the general population." They stopped before a massive door that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black crystal. Lyra placed her hand on a scanner, spoke a phrase in an ancient language, and waited as multiple locks disengaged with deep mechanical sounds. The chamber beyond was vast, filled with data storage devices that hummed softly with contained energy. Holographic displays showed star charts, historical timelines, and streams of information in dozens of different languages. Jake felt like he was standing in the brain of the Empire itself. "This archive contains records going back over 100,000 years, Lyra explained as she led him to a specific section, including detailed observations of thousands of different worlds and species. She activated a display that showed a familiar blue and green planet. Jake's breath caught as he recognized Earth from space, but the image was dated far earlier than humans should have had any contact with galactic civilization. "This is Earth as it appeared 50,000 years ago," Lyra said quietly. "We have been watching your world for a very long time." Jake stared at the display as it showed a time-lapse progression of human development. Cities rising and falling, continents shifting, ice ages coming and going. But overlaid on the natural progression were subtle indicators that made Jake's blood run cold. "You were influencing us," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "All along, you were guiding human development." Lyra nodded, her expression pained, not controlling, guiding. Small interventions at crucial moments. A technological breakthrough shared with the right scientist. A natural disaster prevented or mitigated. Wars ended before they could destroy entire civilizations. The displays showed example after example. The development of agriculture had been accelerated by the introduction of hardy crop strains. Major plagues had been stopped by medicines that appeared just when they were needed most. Even human space exploration had been subtly encouraged through the placement of certain mineral deposits that made rocket fuel more accessible. "Why?" Jake asked, though part of him was beginning to understand the terrible answer. "Because we needed you," Lyra said simply. "My people are ancient, Jake. We have lived so long that we have lost something essential. Our emotions have become muted, our creativity limited, our ability to form deep connections damaged by centuries of experience and disappointment." She activated another display that showed genetic analysis charts comparing different species across the galaxy. "We tried to reproduce with dozens of different races, but the offspring were either not viable or inherited only our weaknesses. We needed partners who could balance our ancient wisdom with youthful passion, our vast knowledge with fresh perspectives." Jake felt sick as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. Humans were bred for this. We were cultivated like crops to be your perfect companions. "Not bred," Lyra corrected, "guided. Humanity developed its own path, its own culture, its own values. We simply ensured that path led to genetic and emotional compatibility with us. Every choice your species made was still your choice. We just made sure you had the opportunity to make the right ones." The most shocking revelation came when Lyra showed him files about specific individuals. Jake saw his own face looking back at him from a display dated 20 years earlier, along with detailed psychological profiles and genetic analysis. "You knew about me specifically," Jake said, his voice hollow. "My entire life, everything that led me to Nexus Prime, it was all planned. Your military assignment, your transport breaking down, even the terrorist attack that brought us together," Lyra confirmed. "Everything was carefully orchestrated to test your character and create the opportunity for us to meet. Jake felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. So nothing was real. Our conversations, my feelings, my choice to marry you. It was all manipulation. That is where you are wrong, Lyra said urgently, reaching for his hands. Jake, everything else may have been planned, but what happened between us in that medical bay was completely unexpected. For the first time in 7 centuries, I acted on emotion instead of duty. Jake pulled away from her. How can I believe that? How can I believe anything you say now? Lyra's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her face. Because I am telling you something that could destroy everything I have worked for. Jake, my advisors do not know I am showing you this. They would consider it the ultimate betrayal of imperial security. I am risking my empire, my throne, everything, because I cannot build a marriage on lies. She activated one final display, and Jake saw recordings of their private conversations from the past weeks. But these were not surveillance recordings. They were personal logs that Lyra had made for herself, speaking to the camera like a diary. I do not know what is happening to me, Lyra said in one recording made after their 3rd meeting. For 700 years I have made every decision, based on logic and duty. But this human makes me feel things I thought I had forgotten. He makes me laugh. He makes me hope. He makes me want to be better than I am. In another recording, made just days before Jake accepted her proposal, Lyra looked exhausted and conflicted. I know I should tell him the truth about the planning, about the guidance we gave his species, but I am terrified that he will see only the manipulation and not the genuine feelings that have grown between us. I love him. I actually love him, not because he was designed to be compatible with me, but because of who he is as a person. Jake watched recording after recording of Lyra struggling with her feelings, torn between her duty to her empire and her unexpected love for him. In the final recording, made the night before their wedding, she spoke directly to the camera with desperate honesty. Tomorrow, I marry a man I love, and I do not know if that love is real or programmed. I do not know if his feelings for me are genuine or the result of genetic compatibility we engineered into his species. But I know that when he looks at me, I feel more alive than I have in centuries. Whatever else happens, that feeling is real. That has to be enough. Jake stood in silence for a long time, processing everything he had learned. His entire understanding of himself, his species, and his relationship with Lyra had been turned upside down. But slowly, through the shock and anger, he began to see something else. You could have never told me, he said finally. You could have let me live my whole life without knowing any of this. I considered it, Lyra admitted. It would have been easier, safer. But I realized that if we are going to build something real together, it has to be based on truth, not comfortable lies. Jake thought about everything he had experienced since meeting Lyra. Yes, their initial meeting had been orchestrated. Yes, humanity's development had been guided to make them compatible with her species. But the conversations they had shared, the connection he felt with her, the way she had opened up to him about her loneliness and fears, that had all been genuine. The planning brought us together, Jake said slowly, working through his thoughts. But it did not make us fall in love. That happened because of who we are, not because of genetic programming. That is what I believe, Lyra said. That is what I hope. But Jake, you have to decide for yourself what you can accept. If you cannot trust what we have built together, if you cannot separate the genuine feelings from the artificial circumstances, then we should end this now, before it goes any further. Jake looked around the archive, at the vast records of manipulation and planning that had shaped human history. Then he looked at Lyra, seeing past the Empress to the woman who had risked everything to tell him the truth. I need to ask you something, Jake said, and I need you to promise to answer honestly. Anything, Lyra replied. If humanity had developed differently, if we had not been compatible with your species, would you still have guided and protected us? Lyra considered the question carefully. Yes, she said finally. We began watching your world because we needed compatible partners. But as we observed human development, we came to genuinely care about your species, your creativity, your resilience. Your capacity for both great kindness and great courage impressed us. Even if you had never been useful to us, I believe we would have continued protecting humanity, simply because you deserved to thrive. Jake nodded slowly. Then maybe the manipulation was not as selfish as it seems. Maybe you were protecting us, because you saw something in humanity worth protecting. Does that make a difference to how you feel about all this? Lyra asked. Jake thought about his life before meeting Lyra. Working dead-end jobs, struggling to pay bills, feeling like he was drifting without purpose. Then he thought about the past week, using his skills to solve problems that mattered, helping to improve life for billions of people across the galaxy. I think, Jake said carefully, that maybe the question is not whether our meeting was natural or artificial. Maybe the question is what we do with the opportunity we have been given. Lyra looked at him with hope and uncertainty. What are you saying? I am saying that yes, I am angry about the manipulation. Yes, it hurts to know that so much of what I thought was chance was actually planned. But I am also saying that what we have built together feels real to me. The way you trust me with your fears, the way we work together to solve problems, the way you make me want to be better than I am. That is not something that can be programmed or engineered. Jake took Lyra's hands and looked directly into her ancient eyes. You took a huge risk bringing me here and telling me the truth. You could have kept this secret forever, but you chose honesty over safety. That tells me everything I need to know about who you really are. So what happens now? Lyra asked. Jake smiled, and for the first time since entering the archive, he felt genuinely hopeful. Now we build something real together. Not because some ancient plan brought us together, but because we choose to stay together. We use what we have learned to help both our species grow and learn from each other as equals. Equals, Lyra repeated, as if testing the word. I like that. For 700 years, I have been above everyone and everything. The idea of having a true partner, someone who can challenge me and support me and grow with me, that is something I never dared to hope for. Jake pulled her close and kissed her, and in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that whatever artificial circumstances had brought them together, what they felt for each other was completely real. They had both chosen love over duty, truth over comfort, and the future over the past. Besides, Jake said as they prepared to leave the archive, someone has to keep you from getting too comfortable with all that ancient wisdom. Humanity may have been guided, but we are still pretty good at surprising people. Lyra laughed, and the sound echoed through the vast chamber, filled with the records of the past. I think, she said, that the next few centuries are going to be very interesting indeed.